To welcome to David Zwirner Gallery in Jan Schoonhoven on a very Schoonhoven-esque day. Somehow the weather seems perfect. I'm a director here at the gallery, as many of you know, and I started in April, and I just wanted to say that I'm having the time of my life here, so thank you. I'm joined by Antoon Melissen, who is a Dutch Berlin-based art historian and writer, and he is since many years, a Zero scholar, and with a particular focus on the Nul group, which is the Dutch side of Zero. And I would say the Jan Schoonhoven expert authority. He's working on a monograph, which comes out next summer.
That's right.
And he is our essayist for our publication, which I don't know if I told you, comes out before your book.
Ah, really?
And he's been extremely generous with his scholarship, with his research, with archival materials. So the book is really going to be a lot of very fresh material, which will be, it's probably the first book in English, first important book in English, which we should have in February. So this is, I can say, really the first survey of Schoonhoven in America. And there actually haven't been many museum exhibitions since many years in Europe. I first saw the work in Maastricht over the years, and then I included his work in several Zero exhibitions I did beginning in 2008. Many people saw the show at the Guggenheim, the Zero exhibition. Schoonhoven's sort of almost has a cult following in Holland. I often compare him to Morandi in Italy. He's sort of a national treasure there. And we were able, in a very short period, to sort of put together a kind of representative overview. This room begins in the late 50s and moves through the 60s. The North Gallery, we have pictures or reliefs from the 70s, where he sort of finds his stride, and the scale shifts. The works become slightly larger. And then, we have some important loans from the Museum of Modern Art. But most of the work came from Europe. Very few museums in America up until now own the work. And yet he was very known by artists, especially of the minimal generation and post-minimal generation, who were showing in Holland and in Belgium in the 70s. He connected with artists like Kusama and also Donald Judd. We can talk about that later. The show is kind of bracketed by a relief from 1956, which is his first white relief, and it ends with his last relief from 1991, which it's quite touching to have his last signed relief in the exhibition. And the pivotal moment for him was when he met Piero Manzoni in 1959, and that's where he really became entranced by the color white. And it wasn't so much the pureness of white, but it was the idea of the achrum, no color. And these reliefs are very much about light and reflecting light. And they very much relate to where he comes from, where he lived his whole life, which was Delft. We know Delft through Vermeer. We know Delft, it has a kind of mythic light. The cathedrals, the stained glass windows. And as you look through this exhibition, you see echoes of everyday things that you would see in the landscape of Delft, the stones, the stained glass windows, the rooftops, and they become very poetic, abstract reflections. It's interesting to really think about Schoonhoven and his life. Sometimes it's irrelevant, the separation, but in this case, his story is so interesting. He grew up in 1914, so this exhibition really is the centenary of his birth. That means he was probably 25 when World War II began, and he started showing his work in the late 50s into the early 60s. But he took a job as a postal clerk in The Hague in the early 50s and worked there, despite his success, really until his retirement in the late 80s. And it's kind of fascinating. You know, he worked by day at this desk as a clerk. He wasn't a postman, but he was in the Department of Telephone, Telegraph, and Real Estate. And he needed this kind of structure. And he would talk about how he came home at night totally refreshed, when you might think the opposite. And he apparently, Antoon mentioned, worked standing up, worked at night, standing at his table. He lived in a very historic house, which I can imagine is not much wider than that window. So everything in this room is dictated by the scale of his front door and the kitchen table where he worked. He had no refrigerator in the house his whole life. So it's really an extraordinary story. And when you think about Zero, you know, it was an international network more than a movement. And it was sort of based in several European cities, and there was a lot of exchange and global exchange between, you know, in Milan you had Manzoni and Fontana, Castellani. The core founders of Zero were Uckermark Pina, and then you had centers in Amsterdam and maybe Antwerp. But Delft is kind of a bit off the grid. So let me just ask Antoon, what was it like in the 50s in terms of the gallery structure in Holland, and how was it possible that someone like Schoonhoven attracted this network where people like Kusama were coming to Delft and Manzoni came to Delft, and he wasn't someone who even traveled to his exhibitions, even in Europe. He was a very local guy, you know, much like Morandi and Bologna was very local. And yet he was able to make these works which have this kind of generosity to the viewer and timelessness. They really, the whole idea of scale is so interesting. You're in front of these works and you really have this sense of a kind of infinite extension. You feel big, even if the work is small, it doesn't feel small. And tell us a little bit about the situation in Holland in the 50s.
Let me first tell you how exceptional it is that an artist from Delft, who was neglected all his life in the Netherlands, most of his life, his early years, is now in New York. This is an achievement. We can hardly imagine what a huge accomplishment it is. Delft was in the 50s really a small provincial town. There was not much going on. Talking about the art world in the Netherlands, we could say the same. The museum were very cautious in collecting. The Netherlands had no newspapers with serious art criticism, no art magazines like in Germany, France, Belgium also a bit better. So the climate was culturally impoverished, you could say. This had to do with the war also, of course.
Right.
The Second World War. First World War, not as much. The Netherlands were neutral during the First World War. But of course, not far from Belgium and France, and these countries had, of course, terrible years during this Great War. The Second World War left the Netherlands impoverished, in ruins also, and this was for the cultural climate, it was disastrous, of course.
Right.
And for artists growing up, like Schoonhoven, being born in 1914, this put a huge mark on his development. And when I'm thinking about the earliest works, the years of the war were really for Schoonhoven unproductive years, as he called them himself. He drew a lot, but he always threw it away afterwards. And only after the war was over, he started drawing a bit in the style of Picasso, actually. Schoonhoven had many huge examples before finding his own style, during, let's say, in the mid-50s with this work.
And you see the influence of clay. And of course, one always thinks about Mondrian, and who was already in America at that point. But I see the influence of Mondrian in terms of this kind of almost like a harmonized tension in the work. But he rejected that. Why do you think?
Well, with clay, it's absolutely true. Of course, when you look at a piece like this, it's the idiom of clay. It's a visual language very much related to it. But more than the language of forms, Schoonhoven was very much attracted to the way clay works, like creating as you go along. Something happens, and from that you can go on. So not a planned way of working. And with this, of course, you can see also in the work of Klee, the harmony of shapes and lines is actually the main thing, that's the central theme of the work. Ironically enough, this is also what attracted Schoonhoven in Mondrian. Of course, the harmony between lines and shapes.
Right, right.
But the way it was created, of course, was very much planned.
It's interesting to talk about the materials here, which are maybe not so clear. He really went out and gathered his materials in front of, on the street. And most of what you see here, you know, which really links the reliefs to the drawings, is made of paper in some form. They begin with wood, and then he used actually, in some cases very early on, toilet paper, toilet rolls. And then he was famous for salvaging television boxes, appliances.
Philips. Only Philips.
Of course, Dutch. And so there are different types of corrugated cardboard, and you'll see in the later reliefs, there's a very specific thickness to the ribbing, and he was very particular about that. You know, a work like this, which he called Motel, you know, has a kind of architectural space. And then this is a very transitional, important work, part of a series, what he called Destroyed Structures, where you already see the grid is beginning to kind of appear. And he would build up the surface, creating these, I mean, obviously very interested in light and shadow, and then he would throw a brick on it or step on it, destroy the structure. And the idea was to move away from this kind of expressionist, informal tradition, the personal touch, the artist as the author. He was striving for a kind of what he called, I strive for the bare minimum, and a lack of composition, a kind of stacking of forms. The Dutch side of Newell was much more involved with the everyday, whereas the German Zero was very idealistic, very much in an almost Bauhaus spirit, and much more prolific in terms of their writings, and Schoonhoven was a bit more of an outsider in that respect. And then we move, you'll see really some, I mean, that dish relief is a really important piece with the curved corners. Again, you really see this sort of, they're very much alive, and they change dramatically under different light conditions.
It might be interesting at this point to say something about this work, about the way he worked with cardboard, because there's something is really changing here. We are looking at a, clay-oriented piece, and the cardboard is actually used as he used his pencils before, or his gouache. It's a drawing in cardboard. What happens at the same time, that for the very first time, there's no color, and the light itself becomes a medium. It shapes the forms. And this is the step before going in that direction, where we can see that the actual composition has disappeared. This is an overall structure, while here, just like you said, David, we see architectural references. So there's a huge difference between these worlds. And that's for me very interesting to see these particular two pieces on one wall, because this is the history of Dutch art, of European art of the late 50s, where they moved away from handwriting, from depiction. And of course, Pollock was a huge inspiration also, especially with respect to finding such an overall structure without highlights.
Right, right. But the relationship with Manzoni in 1959 was an important moment.
Manzoni was, of course, much more important, yeah.
What was the turning point in terms of his professional life where he really started to show much more internationally? Even if he didn't visit these exhibitions, was there a particular exhibition or moment?
62, the Null show in Amsterdam was really a highlight for him. It was the first internationally oriented Zero exhibition in the Netherlands, curated by the artists themselves.
Right.
A Stedelijk Museum, a city museum, Amsterdam. And this was in 62. He was born in 1914. So he was not that young anymore by the time that he really gained a bit of recognition. And the newspapers placed this work in this very exhibition very much in the context of Manzoni, of Fontana also, the monochrome, the lack of color.
And 67 though, with the São Paulo Biennale?
67 was even a more important moment when he was selected as one of the 3 artists for the Biennale in São Paulo and won second prize. Now you can say, what's the second prize?
Right.
But nobody in Netherlands knows who the first prize won. So,
right,
so that says enough.
We have the relief from Irving Sten's collection in the small gallery that was in that show.
The demand was increasing incredibly after Sao Paulo for his work. Also, institutions started seriously collecting his work. So let's say the end of the 60s was really a decisive moment for him to, yeah.
I mean, what's interesting, when you go to these museums in Holland, you know, the Gemeentes Museum in The Hague, the Stedelijk, the Van Abbe Museum, the Boymans, they all have a room of Schoonhoven. And I think, you know, through these legendary museum directors at the time, like Wim Baron and Eddie de Wilde and Rudy Fuchs, a lot of American artists, the most progressive American art in the 60s and 70s, from minimal to post-minimal to conceptual, they were all showing in Holland. And they knew of Schoonhoven. Maybe they didn't socialize with him. He was a bit more reclusive, but they knew the work. Donald Judd loved the work and actually did a show of drawings in Schoonhoven's lifetime in Marfa in the late 80s.
There's in fact a very interesting quote Donald Judd stating in an interview with Rudy Fuchs that he regarded Schoonhoven as one of the original sources for American minimal art.
Right.
And he was very well known. And the other way around as well. Schoonhoven was living in Delft, living a very local life, but was very well informed. And for instance, was a huge fan of Agnes Martin.
Interesting.
Especially the drawings, really appealing to him.
Well, you see that.
And of course, we will go on a little bit later, and you can see the connection between the two. You know where it's coming from.
I don't want to bore you, but if anyone has questions, we can also go in the room with the larger reliefs if people are interested. Or
you picked a pretty precise period, late 50s to early 70s.
Right. Yes. You know, when people talk about zero, it's really like 1957, as defined by these exhibitions throughout Europe. It was 57 to 66, which are the dates of Valerie Hilling's show at the Guggenheim. And I think Schoonhoven, again, I always make this connection to Morandi. Doesn't really matter Morandi from the 60s or 50s. In Schoonhoven's case, he worked a little bit in 1970. Antoon talked about his sort of profile and the market. There's really no estate for Schoonhoven. You might ask why. Well, he really sold everything he made. And, but in 1970, actually encouraged by one or two dealers in particular, the scale shifts. And they're not monumental like American art, the scale of American art, but they're 44 inches, they're over a meter. And they kind of, in a way, that's become a kind of very collectible chapter. In other words, I think he's pretty interesting all the way through. If you look at that last relief from 1991, I mean, if you really look at it closely, you see these sort of triangular, what look to be just like cut wood. And it looks like a much simpler, you know, when you think of artists like, you know, what they do later in life, it's a kind of more reductive, distilled experience. But if you look at that closely, it's actually hundreds of little stacked pieces of corrugated cardboard. It's an incredibly manual piece.
Absolutely.
And I'm just fascinated that he needed to keep this job, and he obviously liked, there was something about this kind of structure in his life. Maybe it was, his inner life was very chaotic, and he needed the...
Schoonhoven
he didn't need the money.
Has always struggled with the chaos in his life. Starting from the mid-50s, the family Schoonhoven opened their doors, literally, to, well, let's say, the youngest Dutch avant-garde, writers, poets, musicians also, visual artists. They were welcome every other day, so let's say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. And this went on non-stop in the days between the curtains were drawn.
Right.
And Schoonhoven has always struggled with well, the contrast between his life as being a clerk. On the other hand, he loved to drink his beer and his spirits. He
Tobacco and gin.
he experimented with everything that was available in the Netherlands of the early 60s. So I guess this creates a bit of a picture. But he needed his work as a kind of to steer clear of life getting worse, really. He really needed the regularity, the rhythm of the day. He took the same train every day. Everybody knew him in Delft before because he wore the coat for 30 years, the same coat.
The Loden coat.
He really needed this rhythm in his work. And of course, it's very tempting to look at these works, these repeating forms, and to say, yeah, well, I spoke to people very close to him in the 60s and the 70s, and they confirmed, yeah, in the morning when Schoonhoven woke up, he rolled his cigarettes and he placed them in long rolls like a relief. And every time he smoked one, he took it out in the center and he moved them all, he stacked them as a relief.
Interesting.
His fruit was ordered from ripe to unripe. So if you took one out, the whole pattern shifted. Yeah. And this was something that was going through his whole life. His whole daily life was organized like this. And he needed that in order not to crash, in fact. And
tell us anecdotally, you know, about his relationship with Kusama and the controversy that, I mean, just on a local level, what happened?
Before telling this, you have to bear in mind that Delft is, like I said, really a provincial town, and I cannot stress this enough.
Okay.
Schoonhoven and Kusama met each other in '62 in The Hague, on occasion of an exhibition at Gallery Delta, a famous gallery those days in the Netherlands. An exhibition of Manzoni, Castellani and Schoonhoven together in one show, which was for the Netherlands remarkable, of course, one Dutch guy and two Italians.
Right.
There was also a foreign guest, Yayoi Kusama came. She was a contact of the gallery owner. And Kusama and Schoonhoven had a click from the very, very first moment. It's very hard to imagine why, because I read their correspondence. And Kusama's English was not that well. And Schoonhoven's English was, you could say, non-existent.
Right.
But they had a good click, and they kept in contact. In fact, she stayed over regularly at the Schoonhoven's place. In '67, Schoonhoven had a solo exhibition in The Hague, Gallery Ores, which was the reverse of Zero. Right. And this was an exhibition, a body paint exhibition. She became very famous with, of course. This was the first one in the Netherlands. And they wanted to invite models for the show, but it was weather like this. The models didn't show up, the ballet dancers, so the show was about to flop, and then Schoonhoven said, let me take off my clothing and I will jump in. Bare naked, he got painted by Kusama with dots all over. The press was there, and let's not forget that he was a civil servant. So this created a huge scandal because the next days the images of a naked Schoonhoven were in the local newspaper.
So, and promotion canceled.
He missed the promotion because he came to work the next day without socks. It was such a rough evening that he had a bit of trouble starting up the next day. And this hit the national press, of course, and this is also the year of Sao Paulo, so his name was established in 1 year because of the scandals, because of the international success. Right. And he and Kusama kept contact for a very long time, and just like Nanda Vigo, for instance.
Nanda Vigo was she's still alive, a very interesting artist. She was Piero Manzoni's girlfriend at the time, and also in the Zero show. So he had these contacts. Absolutely, and I spoke to Nanda Vigo a few weeks ago in Milan. I interviewed her for the upcoming monograph, and she told me she had exactly the same. Her work is, well, very different from Schoonhoven's work, but they could relate to each other. They had kind of a shared basis where they were coming from. Right, and, yeah. And these international contacts, this also explains why a provincial town like Delft could actually play a role, because it wasn't about cultural capitals anymore. It was about hubs of exchange in the 60s. Right. Not like, I mean, Paris lost its meaning. This was, of course, in a European context, a very important thing. Well, listen, when you think one of the most significant painters of the last 500 years came from Delft, the same first name, Jan Vermeer, and then Schoonhoven. I mean, there is a cultural tradition there.
Absolutely.
even if it's a small town.
Absolutely. Fabricius also.
Right.
Carol Fabricius.
Exactly.
No, it really has a huge tradition. Of course, everybody keeps speculating about the Delft light. There's even been a team of American scientists measuring the light in Delft during several moments of the day, comparing it to the Delft's paintings of Vermeer and also to the Schoonhoven reliefs.
Wow.
And I'm really not sure if this is an approach,
Convincing.
a convincing approach, but it's a poetic idea to think about these kind of things. And, the light plays a role, absolutely. Delft is not far from the sea. It's a very small town with canals, and the light is absolutely crisp. It's different. The Delft light is different, but it's a bit speculative to.
Sure. Anyway, any other questions or?
I would like to say something more, if it's okay by you.
Please.
I would like to say something more about this work, because this is a very important work, and I think it's quite important to make clear how it's possible that you see such a work like this with an overall structure, without a geometrical base also, and then a few years later you see these serial experiments with repetitions of the same shapes. They are very much connected, because what Schoonhoven tried to do here, is what you told us before, is to exclude handwriting, to move away from a personally charged artwork. And he did that by building a structure out of cardboard, quite regular actually, then covering it with toilet paper, boiled in glue, and then he stepped on it.
Right.
He destroyed it with just one reason, creating an accidental structure. And accidental means no personal handwriting. The ironic thing is that a lot of his friends saw him doing that, they liked it, and they asked him, can we once do it? Can you make the piece for us? And so we step on it. And then he said, no, because then it's not my work anymore. So there's kind of a friction between these.
Interesting.
Starting from this, going to the serial forms, after meeting Manzoni, he realized that it was not just exclusion of color that was very important, but also the repetition of forms. So not like clay going along as you, but working with a scheme.
Right.
He discovered that not the accidental damaging excluded handwriting, but exactly the opposite. Planning, making a drawing. And this is where these shapes come from, these repetitive shapes. And although they look very differently, they're in theory, in background, very much connected, because
well, I mean, that's the interesting contradiction. It seems at times extremely regular. There's almost a potential monotony, and yet they're not monotonous. There's still this kind of sense of handwriting, or almost like a manuscript.
They are the most boring, interesting works to look at.
Exactly.
That's the thing, and this was Schoonhoven very important. They once did experiments, as far as I remember, in '62, making this type of reliefs, the very sober ones, out of aluminum. This didn't work.
Right.
They made two versions, and Schoonhoven said, yeah, it looks perfect. The light works, does its work, but it lost my handwriting. So it was always, when people talk about Schoonhoven, write about Schoonhoven, it's always about these paired concepts, about chaos and order, about anonymity, but also about handwriting. And he tried to steer clear of both of them. So he was always a bit stuck in the middle.
And said very little about his work, which is interesting.
Very little, very little. Yeah.
Good strategy, often, for an artist. Let the work speak for itself.
Especially in a zero context, I would say.
Especially in a zero context.
Thank you.
Thank you.